Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about the ongoing impact on the global economy of the war in Iran, because the situation is now becoming increasingly serious. Oil prices remain above $100 per barrel. Consumer confidence in the USA has dropped to record lows. Major retailers are now issuing warnings about changing consumer behaviour. Businesses are delaying investment decisions. And we're now hearing reports that Iran is in talks with Oman about creating a permanent toll system for the Strait of Hormuz. So in today's video, we'll talk about what all of this means, why the economic damage is continuing to spread, what the key sticking points are preventing any sort of peace deal being agreed, and why the longer this goes on, the bigger the risks become for the global economy. But before we get into all of that, could I ask anybody that hasn't subscribed yet to please hit that red subscribe button? If you can do it just now, that would be great. And that really does help me with the algorithm and also puts a smile on my face. Now, one of the most important things to understand here is just how dramatic the move in oil prices has been, because I think it's easy to become blasé to the news that oil's sitting at $100 plus. At the start of this year, Brent crude was trading at $60 per barrel. Today, it's over $100. And at various points, we've seen prices even higher than that, over $110. And importantly, this is not being driven by booming global demand. This is a supply shock. The world economy is not suddenly consuming massively more oil than it was 6 months ago. What's happening is that a huge amount of supply has either been disrupted, delayed, or placed at risk because of the conflict in the Middle East and the continuing problems around the Strait of Hormuz. Brent crude first moved above $90 per barrel in early March, which means we've now had over 75 days with oil trading above that level. That is an extraordinary period of elevated prices for the global economy to be able to absorb. And the longer oil stays at these levels, the more economic damage starts feeding through. Initially, governments and consumers can absorb some of the pain, but after weeks and now months of elevated energy costs, the impact starts showing up everywhere: in fuel costs, in food costs, in transport costs, manufacturing, airlines, shipping, electricity, chemical production, fertilizer, and retail. Every single part of the economy is now feeling the squeeze. And we're now beginning to see major corporations openly warning about what's happening. Walmart, one of the biggest retailers in the USA, has now warned that higher fuel prices are changing consumer behavior. According to the recent report, customers are no longer filling up their tanks fully when they go to gas stations. Instead of spending $70 or $80 to fill up, people are putting in smaller amounts because they simply can't afford the full cost. And this matters because once consumers start rationing fuel purchases, it tells you financial pressure is building. That is exactly how energy shocks spread through the real economy. Consumers spend more money on necessities like gasoline and less money on discretionary items. So retail sales weaken, corporate profits come under pressure, and eventually businesses start cutting costs. And it's not just Walmart. We're hearing warnings from multiple retailers and businesses about weakening demand and growing uncertainty. Now, it is important to point out that the recent US retail sales figures have continued to show growth, with this being the third consecutive month of rising sales. However, that doesn't necessarily mean the economy is healthy. A significant part of that increase has been driven by higher gasoline prices and spending on essentials. In other words, consumers are spending more money because prices are higher, not because they suddenly feel more confident about the future. And underneath those headline figures, the warning signs are starting to appear. Consumer sentiment in the US has reportedly fallen to record lows because of inflation fears. People are worried about fuel costs, they're worried about food prices, they're worried about electricity bills, and they're worried about what happens next, because one of the biggest problems with inflation caused by supply shocks is that governments and central banks have very limited options. You can't magically create more oil, you can't instantly replace disrupted shipping routes, and you can't quickly rebuild damaged infrastructure. So instead, economies are forced to absorb the pain, and we're now seeing more evidence of that globally. Businesses in Europe and the UK are now delaying investment decisions because of uncertainty over energy prices and supply chains. There are growing concerns about inflation remaining elevated for much longer than previously expected. Bond markets have become increasingly volatile. We talked about that in a recent video. And stock markets have started to acknowledge that this isn't a short-term issue. Initially, markets seemed to believe that all this would go away and everything would calm down quickly. But the longer the disruption continues, the harder it is to maintain that optimism. And that brings us on to Barclays. Barclays has now increased its forecast for Brent crude to average more than $100 per barrel for the rest of 2026. That is a massive change. Only a few months ago, many analysts were expecting oil prices to be around $70 per barrel in this year. Now, major financial institutions are openly talking about triple-digit oil prices lasting for an extended period. And some analysts are warning that if the situation deteriorates further, prices could go significantly higher. It could go to $150 or $200. The key issue remains the Strait of Hormuz. Around 20% of global oil and gas usually flows through that narrow strait of water, so any disruption there has enormous consequences. And now we're hearing reports that Iran is in discussions with Oman about introducing a permanent toll system for vessels using the strait. Now, if you think about that for a moment, even if a ceasefire was agreed tomorrow, a permanent toll system would effectively create an ongoing geopolitical risk premium attached to global energy markets. It would increase shipping costs, it would create uncertainty, and it would reinforce the idea that the Strait of Hormuz can no longer be treated as a stable and secure route. That matters enormously because markets hate uncertainty, and companies hate uncertainty even more. If businesses believe energy prices could spike again at any moment, they become more cautious. Therefore, they delay investment, they reduce hiring, and they conserve cash, which slows economic growth. Now, one of the key questions everyone is asking is this: what would it actually take to agree a peace deal? And this is where things become extremely complicated because the sticking points are huge. Iran wants guarantees around sanctions relief. The United States and its allies want restrictions on Iran's nuclear enrichment program. There are also major disagreements around military activity in the region, missile programs, and control of shipping routes. And even if politicians can agree broad principles, there's still the issue of trust. After years of tensions, sanctions, military action, proxy conflicts, and broken agreements, neither side fully trusts the other, which means negotiations have become incredibly difficult. And that's why markets remain nervous, because there is currently no obvious quick solution. This is not a simple dispute where both sides can immediately step back. There are huge strategic, political, and economic interests involved. And the longer negotiations drag on, the greater the risks become. One of the other concerns that's recently emerged is the suggestion that Iran has now rebuilt large parts of its drone stockpiles. And that's important because if the conflict does reignite or escalate again, there are fears that Iran could launch further attacks against infrastructure across the whole of the Middle East. And that would create an even bigger economic shock. The market is already struggling to cope with existing supply disruptions. If key energy infrastructure, export terminals, pipelines, refineries, or production facilities were damaged, the consequences for global energy markets would be extremely severe. And this is why many economists and analysts are warning that the risks remain heavily skewed to the upside. Yes, there could be a ceasefire, oil prices may eventually come back down, but right now the situation remains extremely fragile, and every additional week of disruption increases the risk of deeper economic damage. We're already seeing inflation pressures building, we're seeing consumer confidence collapsing, we're seeing businesses becoming more cautious, and we're seeing governments coming under increasing pressure because of rising borrowing costs and weaker economic growth. And the reality is that no country completely avoids this. Countries dependent on imported energy and raw materials are obviously feeling the pain first, but eventually the impact spreads everywhere. Higher transport costs increases the price of goods, higher fuel costs increases inflation, higher inflation keeps interest rates elevated, and higher interest rates slow economic growth. That's why this matters so much. This is not just a conflict going on in the Middle East, this is a global economic issue. And until we get clarity around the Strait of Hormuz sanctions, nuclear negotiations, and long-term security arrangements in the Middle East, markets are likely to remain extremely nervous. So I'll keep you posted on any further news and developments, but hopefully you found today's video useful, informative, and most importantly, thought-provoking. If you have liked what I've said, or maybe you didn't like it, but you thought it was quite interesting, then please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. My competition where you can win my property or a cash alternative prize is now coming to a conclusion. So if you haven't bought a ticket yet and you want to get involved, scan the QR code on the screen now if you can, or click the link in the description below. It's another way of helping to fund the channel. Thank you so much to everyone that's supported me in other ways. If you bought me a coffee, sent me a YouTube super thanks, or signed up as a patron or a member, thank you for that support. Genuinely appreciate it.